Alright, first public YouTube vid ever. Anyways, this is the first of a something part series I'm doing, Cringey Fanfic Rewrites. These will focus on recapping, reviewing, and rewriting certain parts of shows, movies, and fiction that I feel could have been done better. Disclaimer 1. Spoilers will be revealed for one or more works of fiction. If you are triggered by spoilers, please consult with Abridge and get over it. Some of the content here requires you to have watched the show to understand it, so I recommend you either go do that first, look it up on Wikipedia, or just watch another reviewer for more context. If you don't care about spoilers, hooray, good for you. Disclaimer 2, this is all the opinion of an amateur artist/writer, so take it with a grain of salt. Or a cup, I guess, I don't know. Depends on how salty you are about these things. Anyways, this week's topic, RWBY. For those of you who are somehow unfamiliar with RWBY, it's a popular web series created by famous animator Monty Oum, responsible for the fantastic Haloid animation, the Dead Fantasy series, and work on various other shows like Red vs. Blue and RWBY. It was also created by Rooster Teeth, the company that made Red vs. Blue, Achievement Hunter, Camp Camp, and other shows over the years. The show focuses on 4 titular characters, Ruby Rose, Weiss Schnee, Blake Belladonna, and Yang Xiaolong. It borrows many common elements from anime and other cartoons, and it was originally made on Microsoft Poser for the first 3 volumes, and switched to Maya starting in Volume 4. Volume 5, its most recent volume, came out in October of last year. And in terms of reception, the volume was seen as subpar. I'm obviously not the first to focus on this show and its flaws. It's a series that has both captivated and disappointed many times. But despite its hiccups, I'm still going to keep watching it. One point of interest of many people is attempting to rewrite parts of the show to improve on the canon version's flaws. Now, there are plenty of channels who have done much better rewrites on the show than I could ever produce, so I'm not going to try to top them. Celtic Phoenix Productions, Fat Man Falling, Unicorn of War, and Mediocrity 4 are the main 4 that inspired me to do this. So, cringy shout out to you guys, yeah. Anyways. But I'm not aiming to rewrite the volumes of RWBY themselves, at least not right now. That would take a long time, and as Celtic has explained, it would require probably a complete restructuring of RWBY itself. I might do a rewrite of individual volumes in the future, but for now, this is what y'all get. So this episode, I'm going to focus on rewriting the show's titular protagonist, Hazel Rainart. Just kidding, I'll do RWBY at some other point. Anyways, Hazel's a more recent addition to RWBY, first appearing in Volume 4, Episode 1, The Next Step. In terms of inspiration, he seems to have been based on the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, with his sister Gretchen being mentioned at one point. He's one of 4 cohorts to Salem, the show's big bad. He serves as the strong man of the group, a massive, unrelenting brute, not unlike characters like Bane or Juggernaut. In terms of personality, he's a stoic and polite individual who is non-confrontational and often takes a backseat to his allies when it comes to operations. Be it helping an innocent youth with a train ticket or negotiating with Faunus terrorists, on the surface Hazel is a calm and helpful soul. He abhors unnecessary death and is unwilling to fight if he doesn't need to. His passive nature probably means that him and Jiren could probably be drinking buddies. Of course, when he does cut loose, he cuts loose. Word of advice, don't mention Ozpin around this guy. Ever. As for abilities, his semblance allows him to be immune to pain, letting him shrug off wounds as severe as being thrown through buildings and outright impalement. He can also allegedly recharge his aura rapidly. Through his semblance, he can inject dust crystals into himself to augment his attacks with elements like electricity and fire. In short, he uses magical steroids. Hazel was a refreshing addition to the villains, as he provided a nice contrast to the previously smug and sadistic ensemble of Cinder, Mercury, Adam, and Roman. Rather than torture others or revel in chaos, he was the oddball of the Apocalypse cult, as his pacifistic ways differed from their assholery. In terms of his design, it's alright. I mean, I'm no pro artist, but his design just didn't stand out too much to me. In fact, the only new villain whose design stood out to me in the Volume 4 premiere was Tyrion's. Watts and Hazel's coats were so similar in appearance that I felt like I could lump them together like brothers. Even when Hazel tore his coat off, the brown shirt just felt bland. Compare that to the likes of Torchwick, Neo, Emerald, and Adam before his edgy makeover, and you'll see why I'm not too fond of his look. That being said, I love his superpower, and I think it's an interesting mix of pros and cons. Namely that you can shrug off injuries with ease, but might disregard one severe enough to kill you if left untreated. The biggest problem I had with him by far was his backstory. Reviewers like Unicorn of War pointed out just how bland and unoriginal his backstory was. And I have to agree, it made his character sympathetic, sure, but it's nothing we haven't seen before. The age-old, "you killed my family, prepare to die" motive is a common trope in works of fiction, both good and bad. Of course, it's still important to remember that unoriginality in itself isn't bad. If it's pulled off well, it can make for a compelling and interesting story or character. They didn't do that with him. Hazel's backstory is not only unoriginal, it's presented in a lackluster fashion. His previous appearances were sparse and built up an air of mystery to him that left me eager to discover his secret. And then it came, and then it passed. The way it was revealed can only be described as the equivalent of a codec conversation. Oscar? Osmond, this guy's really tough. What's the deal with him? Hazel's sister Gretchen was once enrolled in my school,
but died on a training mission, so he blamed me for it, claiming that I send kids to their deaths fighting Salem on a regular basis. So he joined Salem to stop me from sending kids to their deaths by killing the same kids he accuses me of killing.
Oh. Also, he's Magical Bane, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, that's, I'm not lying, that's pretty much how they say it in the show. In a volume already marred by too much exposition, all the mystery to Hazel is removed by yet another bout of exposition. It's rushed, it's awkward, and it leaves me with one question. Why? Why is Hazel on Salem's side if these are the circumstances behind his allegiance? If it weren't for Salem, the Grimm would never be as big a threat as they are, and the relics wouldn't be at risk. The academies and huntsmen would be unnecessary, and wouldn't exist. Gretchen would never have enlisted and died on that training mission, thus meaning that Hazel is fighting for the inadvertent cause of his sister's death. Good for him. So all in all, he's a mixed bag, just like the show. But criticizing him isn't the only thing I came here to do today. As you know, this is Cringey Fanfic Rewrite. So, first, I'm going to suggest a way to improve the way his backstory was presented without altering it. Then I'll suggest my own version of Hazel's backstory, one that I think would help improve on Hazel's primary purpose in the story, to make Osmond more morally ambiguous. First off, let's keep Hazel's backstory and fix only the presentation of it. In Volume 5, Hazel's backstory is presented via an awkward exposition dump by Osmond in the middle of their fight. In Rewrite A, we'll withhold the full truth behind his backstory and instead imply it to the viewers. Given the fact that Osmond is involved with Hazel's past and Oscar is the one who learns about it in the actual show, we'll use him as the way to present Hazel's background. Unicorn of War came up with a good way to do this by suggesting in their Volume 5 rewrite that Oscar's whole connecting with Osmond story from Volume 4 could have been saved for the start of Volume 5. Thanks for the idea. This is where Hazel's backstory comes in. At night, Oscar would have dreams of Osmond's past lives, showing glimpses of different versions of the man while obscuring the visuals and audio enough that to the audience, it comes off as a somewhat clear but still garbled mess. After several nights of experiencing Osmond's past lives, Oscar finally hears a coherent moment, where Hazel and Osmond are talking amiably and laughing over coffee. It flashes to Hazel reluctantly saying goodbye to his sister as she goes off to Beacon, then her screams and Hazel crying after her. Then we flip to Hazel confronting Osmond in his office and attacking him despite Osmond's attempts to calm him down. Hazel storms off, and the dream ends. Later on in the same episode, where Oscar is at the train station going down to Haven, he encounters Hazel as he did in the actual show. However, this time he's more on edge because he actually recognizes him from the dream. As in the actual show though, when he asks Osmond who the guy is, Osmond just vaguely replies, "He's someone from my past, someone who shouldn't be taken lightly," as in the actual show. This is all we'd get of Hazel's backstory until episode 12 of the same volume, where, in the actual show, his backstory is revealed. So here, Osmond acknowledges that Hazel was the man in the dream and a former friend of his turned enemy. He still doesn't say why things fell apart, but since the audience can kinda tell the gist of things based on what we've been shown, we don't need to reveal it until later on. Perhaps Hazel could blurt out the whole "she was only a child" thing in the midst of their fight, and this would make Oscar realize what the dream actually means, without spelling it out for us. Now that's just one way to rewrite Hazel's story in a way that keeps the entire mystery from being spoiled at once and building up more mystery behind the character. But what about my version? Yes, what about my version? What would I do for Hazel? Well, if you care to hear it, Rewrite B would revolve around my own idea for Hazel's backstory. In this version, Hazel and Osmond were good friends in one of Osmond's past lives. Now, how long ago this is before the actual series, I'm not gonna say because the writers haven't bothered making their own timeline, so I can't really fit it into an actual timeline. But anyways, Hazel and Osmond, they were fellow huntsmen, perhaps even on the same team as each other, and were like brothers. Think of it like Xavier and Kane Marco if they actually had a good relationship. Hazel's abilities would actually be a product of Osmond's magic. He still has his semblance here, but his fast aura recharge and ability to inject dust regularly are the result of Osmond granting said abilities with his powers. Hey, if he can turn people into birds and avatars, this isn't far-fetched. After being inducted with Osmond's Illuminati group, Hazel would volunteer as the prototype of a special division created by Osmond and Mantle known as Project Golem. These magically enhanced juggernauts would consist of huntsmen and huntresses with similar semblances to Hazel, and would serve as an elite fighting force against the Grimm. Their objective would be to neutralize Grimm strains too dangerous for average huntsmen to defeat. One of those individuals would include his sister, who would also share his pain-numbing semblance. This would be a source of conflict between Hazel and Osmond. Hazel argues that his sister's too young, but Osmond argues that she knows the risks and can make her own choices. Over several years, the team would win many victories and suffer significant losses. These casualties would cause Hazel to worry for the lives of his teammates and his sister. But Osmond, going through a bout of desperation to defeat Salem during this time, chooses to keep them going. These tensions come to a head in a battle against the Grimm Kitsulisks. These fox-like Grimm countered the golems by prioritizing speed, fast hit-and-run attacks, as well as stealth. They could move incredibly quickly, they could turn invisible, create duplicates, and change density. One such pack eventually ends up breaching Vale's defenses and rampages across several villages. Osmond, knowing the risk of sending Hazel's team in, still decides to send them to intercept a pack and its alpha during one raid on a vital mining settlement. The ensuing fight leaves most golems dead, and Hazel's just begging Osmond, please, just send reinforcements or order a retreat. The reason Hazel doesn't try and retreat on his own is because, again, he respects Osmond too much to disobey him. He still sees him as a friend, as a mentor, as a brother. Osmond reasons that sending reinforcements they'd only get in the way, considering the strength of the golems and the capabilities of the Kitsulisks. And so he orders Hazel and Gretchen, as a last resort, to lure the pack's alpha into the mines themselves. Hazel's sister is eventually critically wounded, and volunteers to stay behind to collapse the cave with the alpha in it. She succeeds, and leaves Hazel as the only survivor of Project Golem. When Hazel confronts him, Osmond argues that their sacrifice was necessary to stop the Grimm, to which Hazel replies,
I've heard it all before. When there were 100 of us, you told me this. When there were 50 of us, you told me this. When there were 2 of us left in those mines, you told me this. And now it's just me. We're no closer to that finish line you promised me all those years ago. We're no closer to being free from their tyranny. So you tell me, how many more of us need to die before this war ends?
To which Osmond replies, as many as are necessary. At this, Hazel storms out of the office in Beacon, cutting off his friendship with Oz. He goes off to a bar to sulk, and it's at this point that Hazel is approached by a man who introduces himself as Arthur Watts. Watts claims to be part of the Mantle Special Forces and empathizes with Hazel's feelings of imprisonment. He offers to bring Hazel to someone who can help him gain control of his life again, to which Hazel gladly accepts. Watts brings Hazel to Salem. How, I'm not quite too sure yet, this is still a rough draft. And despite Hazel's initial outbursts and attempts to attack her, he eventually calms down. Salem convinces Hazel that she's not aiming to destroy the world with relics. No, she aims to change it in favor of the kingdoms by creating a world beyond conflict. She reminds Hazel of his endless battles for Osmond, and where that left him, and persuades him to change sides. Hazel agrees to set up an ambush against Osmond by arranging a meeting with him during the evening. Sound familiar? They meet over coffee, and despite Hazel's half-hearted attempts to play nice, the meeting quickly goes south when Osmond brings up Gretchen. Hazel signals the ambush and he's joined by Tyrion, as well as a huge horde of Grimm. Osmond's cane's knocked out of his hand, and Osmond is just left there dumbfounded. He questions Hazel's actions, but Hazel replies that he's only doing what he thinks is necessary. The battle would be fierce, with Osmond eventually prevailing but running out of aura in the process. Tyrion and Hazel would approach him to finish him off, but a flash of light stuns them as a dark figure with silver eyes stands in front of Osmond. No, this isn't Summer. They emit a second flash of light, and the pair disappear. The fight itself forever destroys Osmond and Hazel's friendship. Meanwhile, in Salem's lair, Watts apologizes for their failure. Salem assures him that the attack was successful because it fulfilled several purposes. 1, she saw Hazel's abilities firsthand. 2, she saw his synergy with Tyrion. 3, she recognized the need to improve the Grimm strains used for ambush tactics. And 4, she confirmed one creeping suspicion. Osmond's powers were weakening. And thus ends the rewritten Hazel's backstory. I had some other ideas, like Hazel being the one who killed Summer Rose based on that one line in the next step, and Salem extending his life to present day, which explains how he was able to survive so long. But that's about it. Now, how this backstory would be presented would be similar to Rewrite A's method, with the dialogue and flashbacks basically being altered to incorporate the different events. Now you may ask, how is this better than the canon version? Well, I don't know, you tell me if you thought this Hazel rewrite or the one before it was better or worse than the canon backstory, and how it was presented. Regardless, I'll still tell you what this version was aimed at accomplishing. First off, it makes Hazel's beef with Osmond really personal. It's not simply that Osmond got his sister killed, he used Hazel, a close friend, as a tool in his war. Hazel lost everything, and everyone, and had nothing to show for it at the end of the day. Salem, on the other hand, offered a much more compelling incentive than slaving away in some eternal conflict. Hazel's betrayal would make much more sense here since he would have been pushed to the brink by Osmond's actions. I was really interested in the idea that many of Osmond's greatest foes and antagonists in the show could have been written in a way that they were a product of his own poor choices, as if many of the events in the series were just a product of his sins, in a way. Second, it makes Osmond more complex. Now, I was kind of thinking about it, and in a way, when you kind of boil it down, Osmond shouldn't just be some godlike being. He's a human, a flawed human capable of making selfish choices, a flawed human subjected to an endless cycle of war with Salem, and that would be enough for a person to become desperate to sacrifice anything and anyone for victory. It should also be considered that immortality of any kind would kind of make personal relationships with mortals rather trivial, so him being a dick to Hazel wouldn't be too unrealistic in my opinion. It would help strengthen the angle that Volume 5 was originally going for by trying to cast doubt onto Osmond, by really making you doubt Osmond. See, the problem with the canon version that I found was that Osmond, in both cases against him in this volume, is still technically in the moral high ground, so it makes both cases kind of weak. For instance, like ultimately for Crow and Raven, turning into birds. It falls flat because 1, Crow already states that it was their choice to begin with, and 2, there's never any negative consequences for this. Okay, so we turned you into birds, but you clearly have control of when you can transform, and there's no visible pain or audible pain. We never get to see the transformation sequence, so we don't get to see whether or not there's any sort of discomfort from this process. So ultimately, this already falls flat on its face. The second argument that the volume tries to put against Osmond is what happens with Hazel's sister. The whole problem with this is, though, ultimately Osmond wasn't directly responsible for Gretchen's death, in the same way Salem wasn't directly responsible, as far as we know. In fact, Osmond already makes it clear to RWBY and the rest of the gang on their first sort of meetup, is that they shouldn't hesitate to destroy everything in their path or they will die. He makes the possibility of death very clear. Oscar even points out that Gretchen knew the risks of becoming a huntress. So for Hazel to suddenly just go, "Oh no, I lost my sister because of Osmond," is kind of ridiculous because they all knew the risks. It's not like Osmond's directly responsible, and he already makes the students well aware that they could die on the missions. So once again, it's not like he's really the culprit behind all of it. But here, Osman actually makes selfish choices, and it makes sense why he'd make them. It would really cast doubt on the heroes because they find out about his role in Hazel's creation and think, well, our wonderful mentor is capable of screwing up, essentially, and screwing up in a way that isn't necessarily one way or another, it was good, it was bad. Finally, it makes Salem and Watts more complex as well. Salem is shown as being basically affable and somewhat reasonable already. But here, she'd be capable of empathizing with Hazel and even presenting something beyond a generic destroy or dominate world goal. It would really make one wonder whether she's really evil. Watts, on the other hand, would be shown to be more than just Mr. Shit-Eating Grin with a nice mustache. He'd be naturally curious and have a camaraderie with Hazel over their shared past fighting Grimm, and of course eventually leaving the military. I also had the idea for him, Tyrion, and Hazel, in that each of them would be approached by Salem and join her for one reason or the other of their own free will. Their lives would be extended with her powers as a result, and they would serve as hidden commanders of the Grimm hordes over several centuries until Cinder's induction into the group. This in turn would make Cinder's insecurities, revealed in Volume 4, way more apparent, because she really would be the small fry in a sea of ancient big fish. But we're not focusing on Cinder here today, we're focusing on Hazel, so that's a story for another time. If you somehow enjoyed this or managed to endure my rambling, disgusting voice, leave a like, favorite, subscribe, eat some pie, and maybe leave a comment down below about your thoughts on this and RWBY in general. I'm planning on making more of these rewrites on not only characters and stories from RWBY, but perhaps other shows in the future. So yeah, tune in whenever, you can check regularly, ring that bell, or apparently there's a bell you have to ring now. And yeah, I'll try to get a Twitter at some point, maybe an Instagram, but for now, this is kind of all you get. So yeah. Peace.